The iron padlock rattled against the barn door as Hawthorne Sullivan approached through the pre-dawn darkness, his massive frame casting shadows across the weathered wood in the faint moonlight of that cold November morning in 1877. He had been tracking a wounded elk through the Sierra Nevada foothills for 2 days, and the abandoned ranch outside Petaluma, California, seemed like a good place to rest before continuing his journey back to his mountain cabin. What he heard next made every muscle in his 6'4" body tense with alertness. A woman's muffled cry of pain coming from inside the locked structure. Hawthorne's calloused hands gripped the padlock, his biceps flexing beneath his buckskin jacket as he examined it in the dim light. His long brown hair, streaked with sun-bleached highlights from years in the high country, fell across his weathered face as he leaned closer. Another sound emerged from within, weaker this time, and something primal surged through him. Without hesitation, he reached for the hunting knife strapped to his thigh and wedged it into the wooden frame, working the blade until the entire locking mechanism tore free from the rotting wood with a splintering crack. The barn door swung open, and the smell of hay and fear hit him immediately. In the corner, illuminated by the silver moonlight streaming through gaps in the walls, lay a young black woman, her body curled protectively around her swollen belly. Her dark skin glistened with sweat despite the cold, and her eyes widened with terror when she saw his towering silhouette in the doorway. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse and cracked. "Please don't hurt me." Hawthorne immediately raised both hands, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "I am not going to hurt you, madam. My name is Hawthorne Sullivan. I heard you crying out. Are you injured?" The woman's chest heaved with labored breathing, and she clutched at her belly. "The baby," she gasped. "Something is wrong. The baby is coming. But it is too early." In 2 strides, Hawthorne crossed the barn and knelt beside her, his experienced eyes taking in her condition. He had helped deliver foals, calves, and even a few human babies during his 42 years, most of them in remote mountain locations, where doctors were nothing but a distant dream. This woman was in active labor, that much was clear, and from the way she was bleeding, something was definitely not right. "How long have you been locked in here?" he asked, his deep voice steady and calm as he pulled off his jacket and folded it to place under her head. 2 days, she managed between contractions. Maybe 3. I lost count. They left me here when they found out the baby was coming. Said I was no use to them anymore if I could not work. Rage flashed through Hawthorne's chest, hot and fierce, but he forced it down. Right now, this woman needed his help, not his anger. "What is your name?" "Beatrice," she said, then cried out as another contraction seized her body. "Beatrice Porter." "All right, Beatrice. I need you to trust me. I have delivered babies before, and I am going to get you and your child through this. But I need to examine you and see what is happening. Is that all right?" Beatrice looked into his eyes, searching for something, and whatever she found, there must have been enough, because she nodded weakly. Hawthorne quickly assessed the situation and realized they did not have time to move her anywhere. The baby was coming now, ready or not, and from what he could see, it was coming feet first. "The baby is breech," he told her honestly. "That means it is coming out the wrong way. It is going to be more difficult, and it is going to hurt more. But we can do this together. Do you understand?" Tears streamed down Beatrice's face, but she nodded again. "I do not want to die," she whispered, "and I do not want my baby to die. Neither of those things is going to happen," Hawthorne said with such conviction that even he almost believed it. "But I need you to be strong for me, Beatrice. Can you do that?" "Yes." For the next 3 hours, as dawn began to paint the sky outside in shades of pink and gold. Hawthorne worked with steady hands and quiet encouragement. He had carried Beatrice to a cleaner area of the barn, laid out fresh hay, and used water from his canteen to clean her as best he could. The delivery was complicated and dangerous, but Hawthorne had spent decades in situations where failure meant death, and he refused to let that happen now. "Push now," he instructed as another contraction gripped her. "That is it, Beatrice. You are doing beautifully. Just a little more." Beatrice screamed, her hands gripping handfuls of hay as she bore down with everything she had. Hawthorne could see the baby's tiny feet now, then the legs, and he carefully supported the emerging body, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he worked to guide the infant out without causing injury to either mother or child. "The shoulders are coming," he said. "One more big push when I tell you. Wait for it. Now." Beatrice pushed with a guttural cry that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. And suddenly the baby slipped free into Hawthorne's waiting hands. For a terrible moment, the infant did not make a sound, and Hawthorne's heart clenched in his chest. He quickly cleared the baby's mouth and nose, then rubbed the tiny back vigorously until finally, blessedly, a thin wail pierced the morning air. "It is a boy," Hawthorne said, his voice thick with emotion he had not expected to feel. "You have a son, Beatrice." He placed the crying infant on Beatrice's chest, and the young woman burst into tears, her arms wrapping around her baby with fierce protective love. Hawthorne worked quickly to tie off and cut the umbilical cord with his knife, which he had cleaned in the flame of a match, then covered both mother and child with his jacket and the spare blanket from his pack. As the sun rose fully over the California hills, painting the barn in warm golden light, Hawthorne finally allowed himself to sit back and take a deep breath. Beatrice was still bleeding more than he liked, but she was alive, and so was her son. They had made it through the worst of it. "Thank you," Beatrice whispered, looking up at him with exhausted but grateful eyes. "You saved our lives. I do not even know how to begin to thank you." "You do not need to thank me," Hawthorne said quietly. "But you do need to tell me who locked you in here and why. And you need to tell me where you came from." Beatrice's face darkened with pain that had nothing to do with childbirth. "I was traveling with a wagon train, heading to Sacramento. My husband died of cholera 2 months ago in Nevada. The wagon master, a man named Jedediah Cross, he said I could work off my passage by helping with the cooking and mending. But when I started showing more with the pregnancy, when the work got harder for me, he said I was a burden. 3 days ago, when I went into early labor, he locked me in this barn, said nature would take its course one way or another, and they could not afford to wait around for a dead woman." The rage that Hawthorne had suppressed earlier came roaring back. "They just left you here to die?" "They did." Beatrice looked down at her baby, who had stopped crying and was now nestled against her breast. "If you had not found me, we both would have." Hawthorne stood and walked to the barn door, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. In the distance, he could see the wagon ruts leading away from the property, heading northeast. The train could not have gotten far, not with heavy wagons and oxen. Part of him wanted to go after them right now, to make them answer for what they had done. But the rationale part of his mind knew that Beatrice and her baby needed medical attention more than he needed revenge. "Can you ride?" he asked, turning back to her. Beatrice looked uncertain. "I do not know. Maybe. Where would we go?" "Petaluma is about 8 miles south of here. There is a doctor there, a good one from what I have heard. You need proper care, and so does your son. I have my horse outside. I can carry you both." But you do not even know me, Beatrice said, confusion and something else, maybe hope, crossing her face. Why would you do this for us? Hawthorne met her eyes steadily. Because it is the right thing to do, and because nobody deserves to be left to die like an animal. He went outside and retrieved his horse, a massive buckskin stallion named Bear, who was as strong and steady as his owner. Hawthorne had raised the animal from a colt and trusted him completely. He fashioned a makeshift sling from rope and blankets, securing it so that Beatrice could ride with the baby, safely cradled against her chest, while Hawthorne walked alongside. One hand always on the horse to keep them steady. The journey to Petaluma took most of the morning. Beatrice drifted in and out of consciousness, and Hawthorne kept up a steady stream of quiet talk, partly to keep her awake and partly because the sound of his voice seemed to soothe the baby. He told her about his life in the mountains, about the cabin he had built with his own hands high in the Sierra Nevada, about the winters spent trapping and the summers guiding wealthy men from San Francisco on hunting expeditions. It sounds lonely, Beatrice murmured at one point. It is, Hawthorne admitted, the words coming easier than he expected. But it is the only life I have known for the past 15 years. After my wife died, I could not stay in the settlements anymore. Everything reminded me of her. I am sorry, Beatrice said softly. I know what it is like to lose someone you love. They rode in comfortable silence after that, the autumn sun warming their backs as they traveled south along the dusty road. By the time the buildings of Petaluma came into view, Hawthorne had made a decision, though he was not entirely sure when or why he had made it. He was not going to just deliver Beatrice to the doctor and walk away. He was going to make sure she and her baby had everything they needed, even if it meant delaying his return to the mountains. The doctor, a middle-aged man named Arthur Brennan, took one look at Beatrice and immediately ushered them into his office. He shooed Hawthorne out of the examination room, but emerged 20 minutes later with a grave expression. She is very weak from blood loss and dehydration, Doctor, Brennan said. The baby appears healthy, which is remarkable given the circumstances you described. But she needs rest, proper food, and someone to look after her for at least a few weeks. Does she have family in the area? No, Hawthorne said. She has nobody. The doctor frowned. There is a boarding house down the street run by a woman named Mrs. Chen. She sometimes takes in women in difficult circumstances. I can speak to her, see if she has room. I will pay for it, Hawthorne said immediately. Whatever it costs, I will cover it. Dr. Brennan raised an eyebrow. That is very generous of you, Mr. Sullivan. Most men would not trouble themselves so much for a stranger, especially given the current social climate. Hawthorne's eyes hardened. Then most men are fools. Send me the bill for your services as well. Over the next 2 weeks, Hawthorne found himself lingering in Petaluma far longer than he had planned. He secured a room for Beatrice at Mrs. Chen's boarding house, a tidy establishment run by a shrewd but kind-hearted woman who had emigrated from China 20 years earlier. Mrs. Chen asked no questions about Beatrice's circumstances, simply provided her with a clean room, regular meals, and a quiet place to recover. Hawthorne visited every day, initially just to check on their progress, but increasingly because he found himself drawn to Beatrice in ways he could not fully explain. She was 23 years old, he learned, born free in Pennsylvania and married at 19 to a man who had dreamed of starting a new life in California. That dream had died with him in the Nevada desert, leaving her alone and pregnant in a wagon train full of people who saw her as nothing more than a burden. I thought about turning back, Beatrice admitted one afternoon as they sat in the small garden behind the boarding house. Her son, whom she had named Samuel after her late husband, was sleeping peacefully in her arms. After Samuel died, I mean my husband, I thought about just giving up and going back to Pennsylvania. But then I would feel the baby moving inside me, and I knew I had to keep going. I had to give my child a chance at something better. Hawthorne, sitting on a bench beside her, felt something shift in his chest. He had not expected to feel anything again after Margaret died. For 15 years, he had convinced himself that his capacity for love and connection had died with her. But watching Beatrice with her son, seeing the fierce determination and gentle strength in her eyes, he realized he had been wrong. "You are very brave," he said quietly. Beatrice laughed, though it was not a bitter sound. "I do not feel brave. I feel terrified most of the time. I have no money, no prospects, no husband. I have a baby to care for and no idea how I am going to do it." "You will figure it out," Hawthorne said with certainty. "You are stronger than you think, Beatrice Porter." She turned to look at him, really look at him, and Hawthorne felt the intensity of her gaze, like a physical touch. "Why are you doing all this for us? And please do not say it is just because it is the right thing to do. Nobody is this kind without a reason." Hawthorne was quiet for a long moment, searching for the right words. "When I found you in that barn, when I heard you crying out, something in me woke up that I thought had died years ago. The desire to protect someone, to matter to someone. I saved your life, yes. But maybe in some way, you saved mine too." Beatrice's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled through them. "That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time." As the days passed, their friendship deepened into something more. Hawthorne found himself telling Beatrice things he had never told anyone, about the guilt he still carried over his wife's death, about the loneliness of his mountain existence, about the fear that he had wasted the last 15 years of his life hiding from the world. Beatrice, in turn, opened up about her own fears and hopes, about the dreams she had for her son, about the strength it took to keep moving forward when everything seemed stacked against you. Mrs. Chen, who missed nothing, pulled Hawthorne aside one evening as he was leaving. "That girl upstairs, she is falling in love with you," the older woman said bluntly. "And if I am not mistaken, you are falling in love with her too." Hawthorne started to protest, but Mrs. Chen held up a hand. "I am too old to waste time with denials. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Because if you are just going to break her heart and disappear back into your mountains, then you should leave now before either of you gets hurt worse." "I do not know what I'm going to do," Hawthorne admitted. "I never planned for any of this." "Love does not follow plans," Mrs. Chen said with a knowing smile. "It just happens, whether we are ready or not. But that girl has been through enough pain. She deserves someone who will stay, not someone who will run away when things get difficult." That night, lying in his room at the local inn, Hawthorne stared at the ceiling and forced himself to confront the truth he had been avoiding. He was in love with Beatrice Porter, completely, terrifyingly in love with her, and the thought of leaving her, of going back to his solitary existence in the mountains, made his chest ache with a loneliness he had forgotten was possible to feel. But what could he offer her? He was a 42-year-old mountain man with calloused hands and a face weathered by years of harsh winters. She was a young woman with a baby who needed stability and security, not some aging trapper who spent half the year isolated in the wilderness. What kind of life could he give her? The answer came to him 3 days later, when he overheard 2 men talking in the general store. They were discussing a ranch about 30 miles east of Petaluma that had gone up for sale after the owner died without heirs. The property included a house, a barn, and 300 acres of good grazing land with access to fresh water. Hawthorne made inquiries and discovered that the price was steep but not impossible. He had saved most of the money he earned over the past 15 years, having little to spend it on in the mountains. If he sold his trapping equipment and used all his savings, he could afford the down payment with enough left over to stock the ranch with cattle and supplies. It was insane. It was completely contrary to everything he had planned for his life. But for the first time in 15 years, Hawthorne felt something other than resignation about his future. He felt hope. He told Beatrice about the ranch the next day as they walked through town. Samuel bundled against the cool December air in a sling across Beatrice's chest. She stopped walking and turned to stare at him. "You are going to buy a ranch?" she asked, incredulous. "But I thought you loved the mountains." "I do," Hawthorne said. "But I have realized something these past few weeks. The mountains were not a home, they were a hiding place, and I am tired of hiding." Beatrice's eyes searched his face. "What are you saying, Hawthorne?" He took a deep breath, his heart pounding harder than it had during any mountain lion encounter or grizzly confrontation. "I am saying that I am in love with you, Beatrice Porter. I know it is too soon, and I know I have no right to feel this way. You lost your husband only a few months ago, and you have a child to think about. But I cannot go back to my old life and pretend I never met you. I cannot walk away from you and Samuel." Tears spilled down Beatrice's cheeks, and for a terrible moment, Hawthorne thought he had made a horrible mistake. But then she reached up with one hand and touched his bearded face, her fingers gentle against his rough skin. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been so scared to admit it, even to myself. It felt like a betrayal of Samuel's memory. But I do love you, Hawthorne. You saved my life, yes. But more than that, you gave me hope again. You made me believe that maybe, just maybe, there could be happiness in my future." Hawthorne pulled her close, careful not to crush little Samuel between them, and kissed her with all the pent-up longing and tenderness he had been holding back. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. "Marry me," Hawthorne said. "Come live with me on the ranch. Let me be a father to Samuel and a husband to you. Let me spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to be afraid or alone again." "Yes," Beatrice said without hesitation. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married a week before Christmas in a simple ceremony at Mrs. Chen's boarding house, with Dr. Brennan and a few other townspeople in attendance. Hawthorne wore his best clothes, which were still pretty rough by town standards, but Beatrice looked at him like he was the most handsome man in the world. Mrs. Chen had made Beatrice a beautiful dress from fabric she claimed she had been saving for a special occasion, and little Samuel slept peacefully through the entire ceremony, as if he already knew he was safe and loved. The ranch, which they named Hope's End after much deliberation, was everything Hawthorne had hoped for and more. The house needed work, but it was solid and spacious, with 3 bedrooms and a large kitchen that made Beatrice's eyes light up when she first saw it. The land was good, with rolling hills covered in golden grass and stands of oak trees that provided shade in the summer. That first winter was hard. Hawthorne had experience with mountain winters, but ranch work was different, and there was much he had to learn. Beatrice, despite her recent ordeal, proved to be tireless and resourceful, managing the household with quiet efficiency while caring for Samuel, who was growing stronger and healthier every day. They worked side by side through those cold months, repairing fences, tending to the small herd of cattle Hawthorne had purchased, and slowly making the house into a home. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Samuel between them, and talk about their plans for the future. Hawthorne would tell stories about his years in the mountains, and Beatrice would share memories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, the good memories that she could finally bear to think about again. One night in February, as they lay in bed with moonlight streaming through the window, Beatrice turned to Hawthorne and said, "I never thought I could be this happy again. After losing Samuel, my husband, I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I would spend the rest of my days just surviving, just making it through one day at a time for the sake of my baby. But you gave me more than survival. You gave me a reason to live again." Hawthorne pulled her closer, his large hand spanning the small of her back. "You did the same for me. I was dead inside, Beatrice. I did not even realize it until I found you in that barn. You brought me back to life." They made love that night, with a tenderness and passion that left them both breathless. And afterward, as Beatrice fell asleep in his arms, Hawthorne stared at the ceiling and marveled at how completely his life had changed in just a few short months. He had gone from a solitary mountain man with nothing but his memories and regrets to a husband and father with a family and a future. Spring came early that year, painting the hills around Hope's End in shades of green and gold. The cattle thrived, and Hawthorne began to build his reputation as a fair and knowledgeable rancher. Beatrice planted a garden that flourished under her care, providing them with fresh vegetables and herbs. Samuel was walking now, his chubby legs carrying him around the ranch as he explored his new world with fearless curiosity. On a warm afternoon in May, almost exactly 6 months after Hawthorne had found Beatrice in that barn, a rider approached the ranch. Hawthorne was working on a new section of fence when he saw the man coming, and something about the way he sat his horse made Hawthorne's instincts prickle with warning. He set down his tools and walked toward the house, wanting to be close to Beatrice and Samuel. The rider was a lean man in his 50s with a weathered face and cold eyes. He reined in his horse near the porch where Beatrice was hanging laundry while Samuel played at her feet. "Help you with something?" Hawthorne called out, his voice carrying an edge that made the stranger turn in his saddle. "Name is Jedediah Cross," the man said. "I am looking for a woman who was traveling with my wagon train last fall. Black woman, pregnant. Someone told me in town she might be out here." Hawthorne felt rage surge through him, hot and immediate, but he kept his voice level. "What business do you have with her?" Cross's eyes narrowed. "She owes me money for passage. Thought she could just run off without paying, but I tracked down all my debts eventually." "She does not owe you anything," Hawthorne said, moving to stand between Cross and the porch. "You locked her in a barn and left her to die. You are lucky I do not shoot you right now for what you did." "Big talk from a mountain man playing rancher," Cross sneered. "The woman signed a contract. The law is on my side." "The law says you cannot just abandon someone to die," Beatrice said, her voice shaking but firm as she stood up from where she had been hanging clothes. "You left me locked in that barn with no food, no water, and no way out. You left me there in labor, knowing I would die. What you did was attempted murder, Mr. Cross, and I am sure the sheriff would be very interested to hear about it." Cross's face darkened. "It is your word against mine, woman, and we both know whose word the law is going to believe." "Mine," Hawthorne said flatly, "because I am the one who found her and saw what you did. And unlike you, I have friends in Petaluma who will back up every word we say. Dr. Brennan documented Beatrice's condition when I brought her in. Mrs. Chen can testify to the state she was in. You leave now, Cross, and you do not come back. Ever. Because if I see you near my wife or my son again, your own mother would not recognize what is left of you." The threat was delivered in such a calm, matter-of-fact tone that it was somehow more terrifying than if Hawthorne had shouted. Cross clearly recognized that he was facing a man who meant every word. A man who had survived decades in the wilderness and was not intimidated by empty threats from a wagon master with delusions of authority. "This is not over," Cross muttered, but he was already turning his horse. "Yes, it is," Hawthorne said. "Ride away now while you still can." They watched until Cross was nothing but a speck on the horizon. Then Beatrice collapsed onto the porch steps, shaking. Hawthorne sat beside her and pulled her close, while Samuel, oblivious to the tension, continued playing with a wooden toy horse Hawthorne had carved for him. "Do you think he will come back?" Beatrice asked. "Oh no," Hawthorne said with certainty. "Men like him are bullies and cowards. He knows he has no power here, and he knows I was not bluffing about what would happen if he tried anything. He will slink back to whatever hole he crawled out of and find some other vulnerable person to prey on." "I was so scared," Beatrice admitted. "When I saw him for a moment, I was back in that barn again, locked in the dark and thinking I was going to die." Hawthorne tilted her face up to look at him. "You are never going back to that place, Beatrice. Not physically, and not in your mind. I will spend every day of my life making sure you feel safe and loved. That is a promise." True to his word, Cross never returned. As the months passed, the memory of that encounter faded, replaced by the daily rhythms and joys of ranch life. Beatrice flourished in ways that amazed both of them, revealing a sharp mind for business that complemented Hawthorne's practical skills. Together, they built Hope's End into one of the most successful small ranches in the area. Samuel continued to thrive, growing into a bright and curious boy who followed Hawthorne everywhere, mimicking his walk and trying to help with chores even when he was too small to be much assistance. Hawthorne loved him as completely as if he were his own blood. And Samuel, who would never remember his birth father, knew Hawthorne as the only father he had ever known. In the fall of 1878, Beatrice told Hawthorne she was pregnant again. They had talked about having more children, had hoped for it even. But when it actually happened, Hawthorne was overwhelmed with emotions he struggled to articulate. The thought of Beatrice going through childbirth again terrified him, given what had happened with Samuel. But Dr. Brennan assured them that this pregnancy was progressing normally, and there was no reason to expect complications. Still, Hawthorne hovered over Beatrice like a protective bear, barely letting her lift anything heavier than a teacup and insisting she rest frequently. Beatrice found his overprotectiveness both touching and occasionally frustrating. But she also understood it came from a place of love and concern. "I am not made of glass," she told him one evening as he tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of vegetables in from the garden. "I promise I will tell you if I need help." "I know you are strong," Hawthorne said, taking the basket anyway. "But you are also carrying my child, and I am allowed to worry about you both." Their daughter was born on a warm May evening in 1879, 2 years almost to the day after Cross had shown up at their ranch. The birth was long but uncomplicated, with Dr. Brennan and Mrs. Chen both in attendance. When Hawthorne finally got to hold his daughter, this tiny, perfect being with Beatrice's beautiful dark skin and his own blue eyes, he wept openly. "She is perfect," he whispered, gently touching the baby's tiny hand with one massive finger. "What should we name her?" "Hope," Beatrice said without hesitation. "Because that is what you gave me when you found me in that barn. Hope for a future I thought I had lost." Hope Sullivan was a happy baby who rarely cried and seemed content as long as she could see or hear her parents. Samuel was fascinated by his little sister and appointed himself her protector, a role he took very seriously despite being only 2 years old himself. The years that followed were perhaps the happiest of Hawthorne's life. The ranch prospered, allowing them to expand their herd and even hire a few ranch hands to help with the work. Beatrice's garden grew larger every year, and she began selling her excess produce and preserves in Petaluma, developing a reputation for quality that brought customers from as far away as San Francisco. In 1881, Beatrice gave birth to twin boys, whom they named Henry and Harrison. The twins were identical in appearance, but completely different in temperament. Henry was quiet and thoughtful, content to sit and watch the world around him, while Harrison was constantly in motion, always getting into mischief and keeping his parents on their toes. Their family was complete now, 5 children in a house that rang with laughter and life. Hawthorne, who had once thought he would die alone in his mountain cabin, found himself surrounded by love and noise and the beautiful chaos of family life. There were hard days, of course. Droughts that threatened the cattle, illnesses that swept through the children and left him and Beatrice exhausted with worry, and the ongoing challenges of running a ranch in difficult times. But through it all, their love for each other only deepened. They had built something real and lasting together, something that went beyond the dramatic circumstances of their first meeting. They had created a life, a family, a legacy that would outlive them both. On a summer evening in 1885, 8 years after that fateful November morning when Hawthorne had found Beatrice in the barn, they sat together on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of orange and gold. The children were all asleep inside, tired from a long day of swimming in the creek and playing in the fields. "Do you ever miss it?" Beatrice asked, leaning against Hawthorne's broad shoulder. "The mountains, I mean. The solitude." Hawthorne was quiet for a moment, considering the question honestly. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it," he admitted. "But I would not trade what we have for anything. You gave me a reason to come down from the mountain, Beatrice. You gave me a reason to live instead of just survive." "We saved each other," Beatrice said softly. "That morning in the barn, we saved each other." "We did," Hawthorne agreed, pulling her closer and pressing a kiss to her forehead. "And I would do it all again in a heartbeat." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, they remained there on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms and the comfortable silence of 2 people who knew each other completely. Behind them, through the open windows of the house, they could hear the soft breathing of their sleeping children. Ahead of them lay more years of challenges and triumphs, of joys and sorrows, of all the complicated beauty that made up a life fully lived. But in that moment, on that porch overlooking the land they had built together, Hawthorne Sullivan and Beatrice Porter Sullivan were simply content. They had found each other against all odds, had built a family and a future out of what could have been tragedy. And that, they both knew, was the greatest gift of all. The years continued to unfold with the steady rhythm of ranch life. Samuel grew into a tall, strong young man who inherited Hawthorne's work ethic and Beatrice's sharp mind. He took to ranching naturally, though he also showed an aptitude for reading and learning that delighted both his parents. Beatrice taught him to read from the small collection of books they owned, and Hawthorne made sure to buy more whenever they could afford it. Hope, their daughter named for the future they had built together, proved to be as determined and fierce as her mother. She insisted on learning everything Samuel learned, refusing to be limited by expectations of what girls should or should not do. By the time she was 8, she could rope a calf almost as well as her older brother, and could ride better than most grown men. The twins, Henry and Harrison, were inseparable despite their different personalities. Henry became fascinated with the mechanics of ranch life, always tinkering with equipment and finding ways to make things work better. Harrison, meanwhile, had inherited Hawthorne's connection to nature and spent hours exploring the hills around the ranch, coming back with stories of animals he had seen and tracks he had followed. As the children grew, so did the ranch. Hope's End became known throughout the region not just for its quality cattle, but also for being one of the few places where a black family could count on fair treatment. Hawthorne and Beatrice made it a point to hire hands based on skill and character rather than the color of their skin, a practice that earned them both respect and criticism in equal measure. There were ugly moments, times when prejudice reared its head in ways that reminded them how much the world still needed to change. A neighboring rancher once tried to start trouble by spreading rumors about Beatrice, suggesting she had somehow trapped or tricked Hawthorne into marriage. Hawthorne's response was to ride to the man's ranch and have a conversation that left no doubt about the truth of their relationship or the consequences of spreading lies about his wife. "He will not be trouble again," Hawthorne told Beatrice that evening. His knuckles scraped, but his eyes calm. "What did you do?" Beatrice asked, though she was not sure she wanted to know. "I simply explained to him, in terms he could understand, that you are the best thing that ever happened to me, and that anyone who insults you insults me, and that insulting me is very bad for a man's health." Despite these occasional challenges, their life together remained deeply fulfilling. Hawthorne never stopped being amazed by Beatrice's strength and wisdom. She had taken the trauma of her past and transformed it into compassion for others, often opening their home to people in need, whether they were travelers who needed a meal, ranch hands who needed employment, or families who needed help getting through a difficult winter. In 1890, when Samuel was 13, Beatrice pregnant with their 6th child, and the ranch more prosperous than ever, Dr. Brennan paid them a visit with unexpected news. He was retiring and moving to San Francisco to live with his daughter, and he wanted to sell his practice to a young doctor who had recently arrived in Petaluma. "The new doctor is a woman," Dr. Brennan said with a mischievous glint in his eye. "A graduate of the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. The town council is in an uproar about it, but I think she is exactly what Petaluma needs. I wanted to make sure she had at least a few patients who would give her a chance." "Of course we will," Beatrice said immediately. "What is her name?" "Dr. Elizabeth Winters. She is young, but she is brilliant and dedicated. I think you two will get along well." They did. Dr. Winters delivered Beatrice's 6th child, another boy they named Harold, and over the years became not just their doctor, but also a close family friend. She was one of the few people outside the family who really understood the depth of the bond between Hawthorne and Beatrice, having seen firsthand the way they cared for each other and their children. As the 1890s progressed, Samuel began to talk about wanting to go to college, an idea that both excited and terrified Beatrice. She wanted nothing more than for her children to have opportunities she had never dreamed possible. But the thought of Samuel leaving home, of facing a world that might not be kind to a young black man with ambitions and intelligence, kept her awake at night. "He will be fine," Hawthorne assured her one night as they discussed Samuel's future. "He is strong and smart, and we have raised him to stand up for himself and others. Yes, the world can be cruel, but it can also be wonderful. We cannot protect him from everything, Beatrice. At some point, we have to trust that we have given him the tools he needs to build his own life." "When did you become so wise?" Beatrice asked, managing a smile despite her worry. "The day I met you," Hawthorne said simply. You taught me that hiding from the world does not protect you from pain. It just keeps you from experiencing joy. Samuel did go to college, enrolling at the University of California in Berkeley in 1895 to study agriculture and business. It was one of the hardest days of Beatrice's life, watching her firstborn son ride away toward his future. But it was also one of her proudest. He came home for holidays and summers, full of stories about his classes and his friends, and each time he visited, it was clear he was growing into the kind of man any parent would be proud to claim. Hope, meanwhile, shocked everyone by announcing at age 14 that she wanted to be a veterinarian. It was an unusual ambition for any teenager, but especially for a young black woman in the 1890s. Hawthorne and Beatrice never questioned her dream, though. They had learned long ago that trying to limit their children based on what the world thought was possible was a fool's errand. The twins, now in their teens, were starting to develop their own distinct paths. Henry had started designing and building improvements for the ranch equipment, showing a mechanical aptitude that suggested he might have a future as an engineer. Harrison had begun working with the local sheriff's office as a tracker, using his knowledge of the land and animals to help find lost children and track down stolen livestock. Baby Harold, who was not so much a baby anymore at age 5, was the family charmer, able to wrap anyone around his little finger with his bright smile and infectious laugh. He followed Hawthorne everywhere, insisting that he would be a rancher just like his father when he grew up. In 1898, on a cool October evening, much like the one 21 years earlier when everything had changed, Hawthorne and Beatrice celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. The children had organized a surprise party, inviting friends from all over the region. The barn, which Hawthorne had long since rebuilt and expanded, was decorated with lanterns and flowers, and tables groaned under the weight of food that Beatrice and her daughters had spent days preparing. As the evening wore on and the music played and their friends danced and laughed, Hawthorne pulled Beatrice aside for a quiet moment alone. They walked out into the moonlit night, away from the noise and celebration, to the spot where they had first talked about their future together all those years ago. 20 years, Beatrice said wonderingly. It feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. I know what you mean, Hawthorne said, his arm around her shoulders. Sometimes I still cannot believe this is real, that I get to wake up next to you every morning, that we built all of this together. Do you remember what you said to me that day in the garden at Mrs. Chen's boarding house? You said I would figure it out, that I was stronger than I thought. I remember, Hawthorne said. You were right. But what I did not understand then was that I did not have to figure it out alone. That having someone beside me, someone who believed in me and loved me, made me even stronger than I could have been on my own. Hawthorne turned to face her, his weathered hands gentle as they cupped her face. Even after 20 years and 6 children, even with the silver threading through her hair and the lines around her eyes, Beatrice was still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. I love you, Beatrice Sullivan, he said. I loved you from the moment I carried you out of that barn and realized I would do anything to keep you and your baby safe. And I will love you until the day I die and beyond. I love you too, Beatrice whispered, tears streaming down her face. You saved my life, Hawthorne. Not just that morning in the barn, but every day since. You saved me from despair, from fear, from thinking I was not worthy of happiness. You gave me everything I never knew I needed. They kissed under the stars, surrounded by the land they had worked together, within earshot of the laughter of their children and friends. And in that moment, the circle was complete. The desperate pregnant woman locked in a barn, and the lonely mountain man who found her had become something neither could have imagined. A family, a partnership, a love story that had defied every odd and expectation. The years continued their inexorable march forward. Samuel graduated from Berkeley and returned to Hope's End with his new wife, a kind and intelligent woman named Clara, whom he had met at university. Together, they began to modernize the ranch, incorporating new techniques and technologies that increased productivity while maintaining the values of fairness and quality that Hawthorne and Beatrice had established. Hope did become a veterinarian, studying under Dr. Winters and eventually attending veterinary school in the East. When she returned to California in 1905, she opened her own practice in Petaluma and became the first black female veterinarian in the state, a distinction she wore with pride and humility. The twins both married within a year of each other, Henry to a schoolteacher and Harrison to the daughter of a rancher from the neighboring county. They stayed close to home, Henry building a machine shop in town where he designed agricultural equipment, and Harrison eventually becoming sheriff himself, known throughout the region for his fairness and skill. Harold, the baby of the family, proved to be as good as his word, taking over more and more of the ranch operations as Hawthorne aged. He had Hawthorne's natural instinct for animals and the land, combined with Beatrice's head for business, and under his management, Hope's End continued to thrive. By 1910, Hawthorne was 75 years old and Beatrice was 56. They had slowed down considerably, letting their children and grandchildren take over most of the daily operations of the ranch. But they still walked the property together every evening, holding hands like newlyweds as they surveyed all they had built. One evening in late November, almost exactly 33 years after that fateful morning when their lives had intersected, they stood on the ridge overlooking the ranch house. The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and pink, painting the hills in colors that took Beatrice's breath away, even after decades of seeing the same view. "Do you remember what you promised me?" Beatrice asked, leaning against Hawthorne's still solid frame. "That morning when we first talked about the ranch?" "I remember every promise I ever made you," Hawthorne said. "Which one are you thinking about?" "You said you would make sure I never had to be afraid or alone again, that you would spend the rest of your life taking care of me." "And I have kept that promise," Hawthorne said firmly. "Every single day." "You have," Beatrice agreed. "But I realized something. I want to make you a promise too, one I should have made years ago. I promise that I will be with you for the rest of your days, that you will never be alone again either. That mountain cabin where you spent so many years by yourself, that is not your future. Your future is here, with me, with our family, surrounded by love and laughter until the very end." Hawthorne felt his eyes fill with tears, something that still happened more easily than he would ever admit. "That is all I have ever wanted," he said hoarsely. "To belong somewhere, to matter to someone, to leave something good behind when I am gone." "You have done all that and more," Beatrice said. "Look around you, Hawthorne. Look at what we built. 5 children, 14 grandchildren so far, a ranch that provides employment for dozens of families. We took the worst moment of my life and turned it into something beautiful. That is a legacy worth being proud of." They stood there until the sun fully set and the first stars began to emerge. Two people who had found each other against impossible odds and built a life that exceeded anything either had dared to dream. Behind them, the ranch house glowed with warm light, and they could hear the sounds of family, of grandchildren playing and their children talking and laughing. Hawthorne Sullivan, the lonely mountain man who had stumbled upon a locked barn in the pre-dawn darkness of a November morning in 1877, had found his purpose. He had found his home, He had found his heart. And Beatrice Porter Sullivan, the desperate woman who had been left to die, who had been saved by a stranger who became her husband and the father of her children, had found not just survival, but true happiness. She had found a partner who valued her strength, respected her intelligence, and loved her unconditionally. Together, they had created something that would outlast them both. A family built on love, courage, and the unwavering belief that every person deserves dignity, respect, and the chance to build a better future. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, their path lit by moonlight and the warm glow spilling from the windows, neither of them looked back at the past. They had lived through enough darkness to appreciate the light. Instead, they looked forward to the evening ahead, to the meal waiting for them, to the grandchildren who would demand stories and hugs, to the quiet moments they would steal together before bed. They looked forward to tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that, however many they were blessed to share. Because in the end, that was what mattered most. Not how their story began, in violence and fear and desperation, but how it continued, day after day, year after year, in love and partnership and joy. That was the real miracle of that November morning in 1877. Not just that Hawthorne had saved Beatrice's life, but that in doing so, he had saved his own. And together, they had built something worthy of the second chance they had been given. The legacy of Hope's End lived on for generations after Hawthorne and Beatrice were gone. Their children and grandchildren continued to run the ranch according to the principles their parents had established. Fairness, hard work, and the belief that every person, regardless of their background or circumstances, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. But more than the ranch, more than the material success they had achieved, what endured was the story itself. The story of a mountain man who found a pregnant woman locked in a barn and chose compassion over indifference. The story of a woman who refused to give up, even when everything seemed hopeless. The story of two people who found love in the most unlikely of circumstances, and used that love to build something that would echo through the years. And every November, as the autumn leaves fell and the air grew crisp and cold, the family would gather at Hope's End to remember and celebrate the morning that changed everything. They would stand in the barn, which had been preserved and maintained as a reminder of where their family story began. And they would tell the younger generations about Hawthorne and Beatrice, about courage and kindness and the transformative power of love. Because some stories, the truly important ones, are worth telling again and again. Not because they are easy or comfortable, but because they remind us of what is possible when we choose to act with compassion, when we refuse to look away from suffering, when we open our hearts to the possibility of connection and love. Hawthorne and Beatrice Sullivan lived long lives, both of them passing peacefully in their sleep in the early 1920s, within months of each other, as if neither could bear to be parted from the other for long. They were buried side by side on the ridge overlooking the ranch, under a simple headstone that bore their names and a single inscription: "Together, always." But their love story, that remarkable tale that began in darkness and desperation and bloomed into something beautiful and enduring that lived on. In the memories of their descendants, in the stories told around dinner tables and campfires, in the very bones of the ranch they had built together. It lived on as a testament to what was possible when two broken people found each other and chose to build something new. When a lonely man chose compassion over indifference. When a desperate woman chose to trust a stranger. When two hearts, both battered by life and loss, dared to open themselves to love one more time. That was the real story of Hawthorne Sullivan and Beatrice Porter Sullivan. Not just what he did before dawn on that November morning in 1877, though that act of courage and compassion started everything. The real story was what they did after. The life they built together, the family they raised, the love they shared through 3 decades of joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. The real story was that they loved each other, completely and unreservedly, every single day of their lives together. And in a world that often seemed determined to break people apart, to convince them that love was not enough, they proved otherwise. Their love was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. And that, more than anything else, was what amazed everyone who knew them. Not just what Hawthorne did that morning in the barn, though that was remarkable enough, but what he and Beatrice did every day after, choosing each other, choosing love, choosing to build a life together that honored the second chance they had been given. That was the true miracle of their story. That was what made it worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing down through the generations. Because in the end, we all need reminders that love is possible, even in the darkest moments. That compassion can change lives. That one act of kindness, one choice to help instead of walk away, can ripple outward in ways we cannot even imagine. Hawthorne Sullivan found Beatrice Porter locked in a barn at dawn on a cold November morning in 1877. What he did was save her life and deliver her baby. But what happened after, in the days and months and years that followed, was something even more remarkable. He loved her. She loved him. And together, they built a life that proved love could conquer even the most impossible circumstances. That was their story. That was their legacy. And that was why, more than a century later, people still talked about the mountain man and the woman in the barn, about the love that grew from tragedy, about the family that started in the darkest hour and became a beacon of hope for everyone who knew them. Their story reminded everyone who heard it that no matter how dark the night, no matter how desperate the circumstances, dawn always comes. And sometimes, if we are very lucky, it brings with it the possibility of love, redemption, and a future brighter than anything we dared to imagine. That was what Hawthorne did before dawn on that November morning. He opened the door to possibility. He chose compassion. He saved 2 lives, and in the process, saved his own. And everything else, all the love and laughter and family and joy that followed, flowed from that one choice to help instead of walk away. That was the lesson of their story. That was the gift they left behind. And it was a gift worth treasuring, worth remembering, worth carrying forward into the future. A reminder that love, real love, the kind that transforms lives and builds legacies, is always possible if we are brave enough to open our hearts to it. Hawthorne and Beatrice were brave enough, and because of that courage, because of their willingness to love each other despite all the reasons they could have chosen fear instead, they got to spend their lives together, surrounded by family, filled with purpose, rich in all the ways that truly matter. They got their happily ever after. And they earned it every single day through the choices they made and the love they shared. That was their story, complete and whole, from that desperate dawn to their peaceful endings, a love story for the ages, set in the Wild West, but timeless in its truth. And it all began with a mountain man, a locked barn, and the choice to help instead of walk away. Everything else, all the beauty and love and family that followed, grew from that single seed of compassion planted in the darkness and nurtured into something magnificent by 2 people who refused to give up on the possibility of happiness. That was their gift to the world. That was their legacy, And it endured long after they were gone, a reminder that love, true love, could overcome anything if we were brave enough to reach for it. Hawthorne and Beatrice reached for it. They found it, they kept it, and they lived, truly lived, every day of their lives together. And that was the most amazing thing of all.